Japanese soldiers bit into American chocolate bars and immediately spit them out. They were convinced the Americans were trying to poison them. When tests proved the chocolate was safe, they still wouldn't eat it because nothing that good could be real. 1943. A group of Japanese prisoners arrives at a POW camp in Texas. The guards hand out care packages to each prisoner. Inside are toiletries, cigarettes, and several Hershey bars. The prisoners stare at these brown blocks wrapped in paper. Some think they're compressed rations that need to be mixed with water. Others think they're some kind of medicine. One prisoner unwraps a bar, smells it, takes a tiny bite, and his face goes through about 5 different emotions in 3 seconds. He's convinced he's been poisoned. But then he's not dying. He's tasting something he's never experienced before, something that shouldn't exist. To understand why chocolate broke Japanese prisoners' brains, you need to understand what food was like in Japan during the war. By 1943, Japan was under severe rationing. Sugar was almost impossible to get for civilians. Chocolate was something most Japanese people had heard of but never tasted. It was a luxury item that only the very wealthy could afford before the war, and during the war it basically didn't exist. Japanese soldiers in combat zones had it even worse. Their rations were minimal. Rice, sometimes with vegetables, occasionally fish. If you were lucky, you might get some pickled radish or miso soup. Meat was rare. Sugar was non-existent. The idea of having a concentrated source of sweetness that you could just eat as a snack was completely foreign to Japanese military culture. Japanese soldiers were taught that Americans were decadent and weak because they were obsessed with luxury and comfort. The propaganda showed Americans as fat, lazy people who couldn't handle hardship. Japanese soldiers were told they would win the war because they had spiritual strength and discipline, while Americans had been made soft by their wealthy lifestyle. This narrative was drilled into every soldier from day one of training. So when these prisoners, who'd been taught that Americans were wasteful and weak, were handed what was essentially compressed sugar and fat wrapped in paper, and told it was a casual snack that ordinary American soldiers carried around, it didn't compute. This couldn't be standard issue. This had to be something special, something rare, something that proved they were being treated unusually well for propaganda purposes. The first Japanese prisoners who tried chocolate had wildly different reactions. Some loved it immediately. The sweetness, the smooth texture, the way it melted in your mouth, it was unlike anything they'd experienced. Others hated it. They thought it was too sweet, too rich, almost sickly. A few got physically ill because their bodies weren't used to processing that much sugar and fat at once. Their digestive systems had been running on rice and vegetables for so long that suddenly introducing chocolate was a shock. But the universal reaction was disbelief. Guards would tell prisoners that American soldiers carried these chocolate bars in their field rations. Every soldier, standard issue. The prisoners wouldn't believe it. They thought the guards were lying or exaggerating. Giving soldiers candy as part of their combat rations seemed insane. That's not food. That's a treat. That's something you'd give children on special occasions, not something you'd give to soldiers who need actual nutrition. The guards would explain that chocolate was high in calories and could give you quick energy, which is why it was included in rations. The Japanese prisoners understood this intellectually, but emotionally it still seemed wrong. You're supposed to suffer in war. You're supposed to endure hardship. Being given candy by your own military felt like being coddled, like your commanders didn't think you were tough enough to handle real deprivation. One prisoner who kept a diary described his first experience with a Hershey bar. He wrote that he thought it was a trick. The Americans would give them this incredible food to make them soft, to break their warrior spirit, to make them forget their duty. He refused to eat his chocolate bar for 3 days. He watched other prisoners eat theirs and seem fine. Finally, he tried it and wrote that it was the most confusing experience of his captivity, because something that tasted that good shouldn't be given to prisoners. It should be kept for important people. This reveals something important about the cultural gap. In Japanese military culture, suffering was noble. Endurance of hardship was proof of your strength. The worse your conditions, the more honorable your service. American military culture was completely opposite. The U.S. military tried to keep soldiers as comfortable as possible because comfortable soldiers performed better. If you could give soldiers better food, better equipment, better living conditions, you did it. Not because you were coddling them, but because it made them more effective. The chocolate bar became a symbol of this difference. Japanese soldiers were proud of how little they needed to survive. American soldiers got chocolate. To Japanese prisoners, this seemed backwards. The side that was supposed to be weak and soft was eating candy, while the side that was supposed to be strong and disciplined was starving on rice. But America was winning the war. How did that make sense? As prisoners spent more time in American camps, they started seeing chocolate everywhere. The guards had it. The camp workers had it. Supply trucks would deliver boxes and boxes of the stuff. There were different brands. Hershey's, Nestle, other names the prisoners couldn't pronounce. There were different types. Milk chocolate, dark chocolate, chocolate with nuts, chocolate with other things inside. The variety alone was overwhelming. Some camps had small commissaries where prisoners could buy items using money they earned from work details. Chocolate was always available. Japanese prisoners who'd been in the camps for a while would buy chocolate bars regularly. New prisoners would see this and be scandalized. You're buying candy. You're spending money on sweets. What happened to your discipline? What happened to your warrior spirit? The veterans would explain that you're not going home anytime soon. The war is probably lost, and the chocolate tastes good, so why not? This was a profound shift in mentality. These men had been taught their entire lives that self-denial was virtuous. Now they were in a place where indulgence was normal and nobody judged you for it. The psychological impact of chocolate went deeper than just the taste. It represented abundance. Japanese prisoners came from a country where everything was rationed, where you learned to make do with less, where waste was sinful. American chocolate bars were wrapped in foil and paper. The packaging alone probably cost more to produce than a Japanese soldier's daily rice ration, and Americans just threw the wrappers away. This casual wastefulness was shocking. Guards would sometimes give prisoners extra chocolate bars, just hand them out for no reason. Hey, we got a surplus shipment, you guys want some? To the prisoners, this was incomprehensible. Food was precious. You didn't just give it away because you had extra. You saved it. You rationed it. You made it last. But Americans had so much chocolate that they could afford to be generous with it. Some Japanese prisoners started doing math. If America could produce enough chocolate to give every soldier multiple bars, plus have enough left over to give to prisoners, plus sell it in stores back home, how much chocolate were they making? The industrial capacity required to do this while also fighting a two-front war was staggering. One prisoner calculated that the chocolate given to prisoners in his camp alone would require an entire factory running full-time just to produce. And this was just one camp. There were camps all over America, and American soldiers in the field were getting chocolate too. The scale of production was beyond anything Japan could match. This realization extended beyond chocolate. If America could produce luxury items like candy in the middle of a war, what did that say about their overall industrial capacity? Japanese prisoners started paying attention to everything around them. The guards' uniforms were all new and well-made. The camp buildings were sturdy and freshly painted. The trucks that delivered supplies were new models. Everything suggested a country that wasn't struggling at all. Meanwhile, letters from home told the prisoners that Japan was being bombed, cities were burning, food was scarce, and everyone was suffering. The contrast was stark. America was fighting a war on the other side of the world and still had enough resources to make chocolate bars for prisoners. Japan was fighting a war on its doorstep and couldn't feed its own citizens properly. Chocolate became a measuring stick for the war itself. Japanese prisoners would trade chocolate bars with each other like currency. A Hershey bar was worth about 3 cigarettes. A bar with almonds was worth 5 cigarettes because almonds were even more exotic than chocolate. Some prisoners would hoard chocolate bars, saving them for special occasions or to trade later. Others would eat them immediately, figuring they might as well enjoy them while they could. There were prisoners who refused to eat chocolate on principle. They saw it as giving in, accepting American values, betraying their culture. These men would trade their chocolate to other prisoners for cigarettes or other items, but even these holdouts were in the minority. Most prisoners eventually tried chocolate and had to confront what it meant that the enemy could casually produce something so luxurious. American guards noticed this fascination with chocolate and sometimes used it as a teaching tool. They'd explain how chocolate was made, how it went from cocoa beans to finished bars, how American factories could produce millions of bars a month. Some guards brought in American candy magazines or newspaper ads showing all the different chocolate products available. The prisoners would look at these advertisements showing dozens of varieties of chocolate candy and just be stunned. This wasn't wartime production. This was normal. This was what America was like before the war and apparently during it too. The moment that really drove home what chocolate represented came in August 1945. When Japan surrendered and prisoners learned the war was over, the camp commanders decided to mark the occasion. They threw a party, an actual party with music, food, and entertainment, and they served chocolate cake. Most Japanese prisoners had never seen a cake before, let alone a chocolate cake. This wasn't a chocolate bar. This was an entire dessert made primarily of chocolate, sugar, eggs, and flour, ingredients that were impossible to get in Japan. The cake was huge, big enough to serve hundreds of prisoners. It was decorated with frosting. It looked like something from a fantasy. The prisoners lined up to get slices. Some were excited. Others were suspicious. A few refused to participate because celebrating the end of the war felt wrong when their country had lost. But most took a slice and ate it, and the reaction was similar to the first time they'd tried chocolate bars, but amplified. This was sweetness on a scale they hadn't imagined was possible. This was what Americans considered a normal celebratory food. One prisoner later described eating that chocolate cake as the moment he truly understood that Japan had lost, not because of the surrender announcement, but because of what the cake represented. America had just fought a massive war across 2 oceans, defeated multiple enemies, and still had the resources to bake elaborate chocolate cakes for prisoners. This wasn't a country that had been pushed to its limits. This was a country that had barely been inconvenienced. The chocolate cake became symbolic of everything Japanese prisoners had learned during their captivity. America wasn't the weak, decadent nation they'd been told about. Or rather, it was decadent, but that decadence came from overwhelming abundance. Americans could afford to be wasteful because they had so much. They could afford to give prisoners chocolate because they had chocolate to spare. They could afford to fight a war while maintaining a high standard of living because their economy was just that powerful. Some prisoners who returned to Japan after the war brought chocolate bars with them. These bars became prized possessions, objects of curiosity for people who'd never tasted chocolate. Former prisoners would show their families these Hershey bars and try to explain what they represented. It wasn't just candy. It was proof that everything they'd been told about America was wrong. The propaganda had painted Americans as weak and struggling. The chocolate bars said otherwise. The story of Japanese prisoners and chocolate bars is really a story about cultural collision and the power of material abundance. These prisoners came from a culture that valued austerity, discipline, and suffering. They were taught that spiritual strength mattered more than physical comfort. Then they encountered a culture that said, actually, physical comfort is great, and we're going to maximize it as much as possible because comfortable people are more effective. The chocolate bar was the most visible symbol of this difference. It was sweet, indulgent, seemingly unnecessary, and yet it was everywhere. American soldiers carried it. American guards had it. American prisoners could buy it. It represented a level of abundance that Japanese prisoners literally couldn't process at first, because it contradicted everything they knew about how war was supposed to work. What makes this story particularly interesting is how the prisoners' attitudes toward chocolate changed over time. At first, it was suspicious foreign food that might be poisoned or was at least propaganda. Then it became an interesting novelty. Then it became normal. Eventually, some prisoners actively looked forward to getting chocolate. This progression mirrors their larger understanding of America. At first, they couldn't believe what they were seeing. Then they started to accept it. Finally, they had to confront what it meant for their understanding of the war and their own country. The chocolate bar forced Japanese prisoners to ask uncomfortable questions. If America could produce luxury goods during wartime, what did that say about Japanese propaganda claims that America was on the verge of collapse? If American prisoners of war were eating better than Japanese soldiers in the field, what did that say about the comparative strength of the two nations? If Americans saw nothing wrong with giving soldiers candy, what did that say about Japanese insistence that suffering built character? These weren't easy questions to answer. Some prisoners doubled down on their beliefs, insisting that material wealth didn't matter and Japan was still spiritually superior. Others had their worldview fundamentally shaken. They realized that their country had sent them to fight a war against an enemy they didn't understand, using assumptions that were completely wrong. After the war, chocolate became one of the first American products to be widely imported to Japan. Japanese people, including former soldiers and prisoners, developed a taste for it. Today, Japan is one of the largest consumers of chocolate outside of Europe and North America. The thing that once seemed impossibly foreign and suspicious is now completely normal. You can buy chocolate anywhere in Japan. It's not exotic anymore. But for those Japanese prisoners in the 1940s who bit into their first Hershey bar and couldn't believe something that good was real, chocolate represented a fundamental challenge to everything they thought they knew. It was proof that abundance wasn't weakness. It was proof that America had resources beyond what they'd been told. It was proof, wrapped in brown paper and foil, that Japan had made a terrible mistake in underestimating the enemy. The simple act of eating chocolate became a moment of realization. This is what we were up against. This is why we lost. Not because we lacked courage or fighting spirit, but because the other side had so much of everything that they could afford to give candy to their enemies. That's a hard lesson to learn from a chocolate bar, but it's the lesson that stuck with many of these prisoners for the rest of their lives. Subscribe to see what else shocked Japanese prisoners about America.